Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're diving into something that challenges everything we thought we knew about the first great civilization on Earth. Before you settle in, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into history's forgotten corners. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see this community spread across the globe, all of us gathered here in the quiet hours to explore the past together. Now dim the lights if you can, maybe get comfortable, and let's begin this journey into the distant past. We're going back over 4,000 years to a time when the world's first cities rose from the dusty plains of Mesopotamia, when writing was invented, when laws were codified, when civilization itself was being born. And we're going to talk about how it all came crashing down. Recorded in painful detail on clay tablets that survived when everything else turned to dust. The tablets we're discussing tonight aren't legends or myths. They're real tangible historical documents, thousands of them, excavated from the ruins of ancient cities in what is now Iraq. Many were discovered at Nippur, a sacred city that once stood as the religious heart of Sumer. These weren't found intact in some pristine library. They were pulled from ash layers, from collapsed buildings, from the wreckage of a civilization that met a violent end. And what they tell us is haunting. Picture this. It's 1893, and archaeologists from the University of Pennsylvania are digging through the ruins of ancient Nippur in southern Iraq. The desert sun beats down mercilessly as workers carefully remove layer after layer of accumulated sand and debris. They've been excavating the temple library, a structure that once housed the religious and administrative records of one of Sumer's most sacred cities. The building collapsed millennia ago, burying its contents, but the very fire that destroyed it also baked the clay tablets, inadvertently preserving them. The tablets emerge broken, fragmentary, covered in cuneiform script that hasn't been read in over 2,000 years. Back in Philadelphia, scholars begin the painstaking work of translation. What they discover is extraordinary. These aren't just dry administrative records or religious incantations. These are poems, lamentations, songs of grief composed in the aftermath of a catastrophe so complete that it traumatized an entire culture. The first lines translated by George Barton in 1918 read like a prayer for a dying city, a plea to the gods to spare Ur from destruction. But the gods, according to the text, did not listen. The destruction came anyway, and these tablets document it in excruciating detail. Over the following decades, more tablets were discovered, not just at Nippur, but at other sites across southern Iraq. Uruk, Isin. Each ruined city yielded its own cache of cuneiform documents. Samuel Noah Kramer, one of the great Sumerologists of the 20th century, spent years piecing together fragments from museums around the world. Tablets from Philadelphia, Istanbul, Paris, Oxford, all turned out to be parts of the same compositions, broken pieces of a civilization's death song scattered across the globe by looters and archaeologists. By 1940, Kramer had compiled enough fragments to publish the first complete edition of the Lament for Ur. It was a revelation. Here was an eyewitness account, or near eyewitness account, of the fall of a great city. Not a dry historical chronicle, but poetry that conveyed the emotional reality of living through apocalypse. The bright sun did not rise, one passage reads. Like a twilight star it dawned. The dense fog that veiled the sky, no one could see his fellow. The people moaned. The destruction was so complete, so overwhelming, that it seemed like the end of the world itself. When archaeologists first began translating these tablets in the early 20th century, they expected administrative records, tax documents, perhaps some religious texts. What they found instead were lamentations, poems of grief so profound that they still resonate across the millennia. Songs of mourning for cities that burned, for temples that fell, for a way of life that vanished almost overnight. The Sumerians, it turned out, had documented their own apocalypse. These weren't just historical accounts written by distant observers. These were eyewitness testimonies, recorded by scribes who lived through the catastrophe, or by those who came immediately after, trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. They wrote about fire falling from the sky, about storms that poisoned the land, about enemies who showed no mercy, about gods who turned their faces away. They wrote about starvation, about plague, about the smell of burning cities, about mothers who couldn't feed their children, about temples left empty and silent. The language they used was direct and visceral. One tablet speaks of how the bright sun did not rise, how twilight settled over the land even at midday. Another describes cattle pens burning, shepherds fleeing, fields lying fallow because there was no one left to work them. They tell of enemy soldiers moving through the streets like locusts, of sacred groves being cut down, of the Euphrates running red. These aren't metaphors, these are descriptions of actual events, preserved in baked clay because the fires that destroyed the cities inadvertently preserved the records of that destruction. What makes these tablets particularly remarkable is their sheer number and detail. We're not talking about a handful of fragments here. Tens of thousands of tablets have been recovered from Sumerian sites, and thousands specifically deal with the period of crisis and collapse. They provide an almost day-by-day account of how a civilization unraveled. Administrative texts show grain prices skyrocketing by 60 times their normal cost. Ration lists reveal desperate attempts to feed a starving population. Letters between officials document the breakdown of communication and authority. Year names, which Mesopotamian cultures used to date their documents, track the military campaigns and disasters year by year. The most famous of these texts is known as the Lament for Ur, but there are others too. The Lament for Sumer and Ur, the Lament for Nippur, the Lament for Uruk, the Lament for Eridu. Each one mourns a different city, but together they paint a picture of wholesale destruction across the entire Sumerian heartland, and they all point to the same culprits, the same sequence of events, the same ending. An entire civilization, the first true urban civilization in human history, was systematically destroyed by warfare, environmental collapse, and internal decay. The tablets describe enemies coming from the east, from the land of Elam in what's now southwestern Iran. They describe an army led by a king named Kindatu, who besieged and sacked the city of Ur in the year 2004 before the Common Era. They describe how the last king of the third dynasty of Ur, a man named Ibi-Sin, was captured and taken away to Elam, never to return. They describe temples looted, walls breached, populations massacred or enslaved, entire cities left as smoking ruins. But the tablets also reveal that the military defeat was just the final blow to a civilization already in crisis. Economic documents from the preceding years show a state in terminal decline. Grain prices increased 60-fold. Provincial governors sent desperate letters to the king reporting famines, raids, cut-offs of communication. The elaborate bureaucratic machine that had run the Earth-3 state was breaking down. Officials were defecting. Provinces were declaring independence. The centre could not hold. Environmental factors played a role too. The tablets don't explicitly discuss soil chemistry or climate change, of course. But modern archaeological and geological research fills in the picture. Southern Mesopotamia was suffering from severe salinization, the accumulation of salts in irrigated soils that gradually makes them infertile. Thousands of years of intensive agriculture were catching up with the Sumerians. Crop yields were declining. The very land that had supported the world's first cities was becoming a wasteland, and there was drought. Climatic data from the period around 2,000 years before the Common Era shows a severe aridification event affecting the entire eastern Mediterranean and Middle East. Rivers ran lower, rainfall decreased. The irrigation systems that fed Mesopotamia's cities required constant water, and the water was becoming scarce. Famine was inevitable, and famine weakened the state's ability to defend itself. But who were the Sumerians, and how did they rise to such heights only to fall so far? To understand the magnitude of what was lost, we need to go back to the beginning, to the birth of cities themselves, to a time when humans first learned to live in numbers large enough to be called civilization. We need to understand what Sumer was, what it accomplished, what made it unique. Only then can we fully grasp the tragedy of its destruction and the meaning of those haunting tablets that survived to tell the tale. When archaeologists first began translating these tablets in the early 20th century, they expected administrative records, tax documents, perhaps some religious texts. What they found instead were lamentations, poems of grief so profound that they still resonate across the millennia. Songs of mourning for cities that burned, for temples that fell, for a way of life that vanished almost overnight. The Sumerians, it turned out, had documented their own apocalypse. These weren't just historical accounts written by distant observers. These were eyewitness testimonies, recorded by scribes who lived through the catastrophe, or by those who came immediately after, trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. They wrote about fire falling from the sky, about storms that poisoned the land, about enemies who showed no mercy, about gods who turned their faces away. They wrote about starvation, about plague, about the smell of burning cities, about mothers who couldn't feed their children, about temples left empty and silent. The language they used was direct and visceral. One tablet speaks of how the bright sun did not rise, how twilight settled over the land even at midday. Another describes cattle pens burning, shepherds fleeing, fields lying fallow because there was no one left to work them. They tell of enemy soldiers moving through the streets like locusts, of sacred groves being cut down, of the Euphrates running red. These aren't metaphors, these are descriptions of actual events, preserved in baked clay because the fires that destroyed the cities inadvertently preserved the records of that destruction. What makes these tablets particularly remarkable is their sheer number and detail. We're not talking about a handful of fragments here. Tens of thousands of tablets have been recovered from Sumerian sites, and thousands specifically deal with the period of crisis and collapse. They provide an almost day-by-day account of how a civilization unraveled. Administrative texts show grain prices skyrocketing by 60 times their normal cost. Ration lists reveal desperate attempts to feed a starving population. Letters between officials document the breakdown of communication and authority. Year names, which Mesopotamian cultures used to date their documents, track the military campaigns and disasters year by year. The most famous of these texts is known as the Lament for Ur, but there are others too. The Lament for Sumer and Ur, the Lament for Nippur, the Lament for Uruk, the Lament for Eridu. Each one mourns a different city, but together they paint a picture of wholesale destruction across the entire Sumerian heartland. And they all point to the same culprits, the same sequence of events, the same ending. An entire civilization, the first true urban civilization in human history, was systematically destroyed by warfare, environmental collapse, and internal decay. But who were the Sumerians, and how did they rise to such heights, only to fall so far? To understand the magnitude of what was lost, we need to go back to the beginning, to the birth of cities themselves, to a time when humans first learned to live in numbers large enough to be called civilization. The rise of Sumer, foundation of civilization. The story begins around 5,500 years ago, in the southern reaches of Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates flowed down from the mountains of Anatolia through the vast Mesopotamian plain and emptied into the Persian Gulf. It was hot, brutally so in summer, with temperatures regularly exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. It was flat, a landscape so level that the horizon stretched unbroken in every direction. And it was fertile beyond measure when properly managed. The rivers deposited rich alluvial soil with every flood, creating some of the most productive agricultural land on Earth. But that productivity came with a price. It required management, cooperation, and organization on a scale never before attempted by human beings. This is where the Sumerians entered history. We don't know where they came from originally. Their language doesn't relate to any other known language family. It's neither Semitic nor Indo-European, neither related to the tongues spoken in the Iranian highlands to the east, nor to the languages of Anatolia to the north. It stands alone, an isolate hinting at origins lost in prehistory. Linguistic analysis shows no clear connections to any living or extinct language. It's as if the Sumerians appeared from nowhere, though of course that's not literally true. They came from somewhere, perhaps from the east, perhaps from the south along the shores of the Persian Gulf. Perhaps they were indigenous to southern Mesopotamia all along. We simply don't know. What we do know is that by around 4,500 years before the Common Era, Sumerian-speaking people were settling the southern Mesopotamian plain, building villages that would grow into the world's first cities. Archaeological surveys show the progression clearly. Small farming settlements appear in the 6th millennium before the Common Era, clustered near water sources. These were simple villages of mud brick houses, where extended families grew barley and wheat, raised sheep and goats, and made pottery by hand. Nothing special, nothing you couldn't find in many parts of the world at that time. But something changed around 5,000 years before the Common Era, during what archaeologists call the Uruk period, named after the city that would become the largest and most influential. The settlements started growing. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. By 3,500 years before the Common Era, Uruk covered 6 square kilometers, an enormous area for that time, and housed perhaps 50,000 people. 50,000! To put that in perspective, most human settlements throughout history have been villages of a few hundred people. Cities of thousands were rare. Cities of tens of thousands were unprecedented. Uruk was doing something that had never been done before. The transformation from village to city happened over centuries, driven by the possibilities and demands of irrigation agriculture. In this flat, arid landscape, farming depended entirely on managing water from the 2 rivers. The annual rainfall in southern Mesopotamia was less than 200 millimeters, far too little to support agriculture. But the Tigris and Euphrates brought water from the mountains of Anatolia, where rainfall was abundant. The trick was getting that water from the river to the fields. Small canals had to be dug, maintained, and controlled. This required coordination between settlements, shared labour, and someone to organise it all. You couldn't just have individual farmers digging their own ditches. Water management had to be systematic, planned, maintained. Canals had to be cleaned of silt regularly or they'd clog. Water had to be distributed fairly or upstream users would take it all. Disputes had to be resolved or they'd turn violent. Out of this practical necessity came social hierarchy, specialised labour, and eventually urban civilization. The process was gradual. At first, village leaders probably just coordinated canal digging among neighbouring settlements. But as the irrigation networks grew more complex, as more land came under cultivation, as populations increased, the administrative requirements became more sophisticated. Someone had to keep track of which settlements owed labour for canal maintenance. Someone had to adjudicate water rights disputes. Someone had to organise defence against raids from pastoralists or rival settlements. These functions coalesced into formal leadership positions, and those leaders needed support staff. Scribes to keep records, soldiers to enforce decisions, craftspeople to make tools and weapons, priests to intercede with the gods who controlled the floods and rains. The temples became the organizational centers of this emerging civilization. In Sumerian theology, each city was owned by a specific god or goddess. The temple was the deity's house on earth, and the city's land was the deity's estate. The temple complex wasn't just a place of worship, it was an economic institution, a landowner, an employer, a redistributive center. Farmers brought their produce to the temple as rent or tax or offering. The temple then redistributed this produce as rations to its workers, as offerings to the gods, as trade goods to acquire resources Sumer lacked. By 3,200 years before the Common Era, true cities had emerged. Uruk, the largest and most famous, covered 6 square kilometers and housed perhaps 50,000 people, an almost incomprehensible number for that era. But it wasn't alone. Lagash, Nippur, Eridu, Kish, Umma, Shuruppak, each grew into substantial urban centres with populations in the tens of thousands. They weren't just big villages. They were complex societies with monumental architecture, organised religion, professional armies, craft specialisation, long-distance trade, and most crucially, writing. Walk through one of these cities at its height, around 3,000 years before the Common Era, and you'd be struck first by the smell. Thousands of people living in close quarters, animals in pens, smoke from cooking fires and kilns, the earthy scent of the river, the metallic tang of bronze being worked. The noise would be constant, people calling to each other in Sumerian, the sounds of construction, animals bleating and lowing, children playing in the narrow streets between mud brick houses. The streets themselves were unpaved, just packed earth that turned to mud when it rained, or when water from the canals flooded. Houses crowded together, their blank exterior walls presenting a defensive face to the world, while concealing interior courtyards where families lived their private lives. The wealthy had larger houses, 2 stories perhaps, with multiple rooms around a central courtyard. The poor lived in single rooms, entire families in spaces not much bigger than a modern bedroom. But dominating everything, visible from anywhere in the city, was the ziggurat, the massive stepped pyramid that served as the god's house. These were enormous structures, the largest buildings humans had yet created. The ziggurat of Ur, built later during the 3rd dynasty but similar to earlier structures, still stands partially intact. It rises in 3 tiers to a height of over 20 meters, and that's after millennia of erosion. When new, it would have been even taller, perhaps 30 meters or more. The structure was made of millions of mud bricks, sun-dried and kiln-baked, faced with bitumen and baked brick to protect against weathering. Climbing the ziggurat stairs, you'd ascend through 3 levels, each tier smaller than the one below, creating the characteristic stepped pyramid shape. At the top sat the temple proper, a small shrine where the god's cult statue resided, and where priests performed daily rituals. The god had to be fed, clothed, entertained. Musicians played for the god. Priests chanted hymns. Offerings of food and drink were presented. This wasn't metaphorical. The Sumerians believed their gods were real entities who actually lived in these temples and required care. If the god wasn't properly cared for, he or she might leave, and without the god's protection, the city would be doomed. Cuneiform script, invented by the Sumerians around 3,200 years before the Common Era, began as simple pictographs pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. A picture of a head meant head. A picture of a bowl meant bowl. A picture of a foot meant foot or walking or going. These early texts were accounting documents, records of transactions. Temple officials needed to track how much grain was stored, how much was distributed, who owed what. The earliest tablets are just lists. So many jars of oil, so many sheep, so many days of labor owed. But over time, these pictures became more abstract, more stylized, evolving into the wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. The Sumerians discovered that you could represent sounds with these signs, not just objects. A picture that originally meant arrow could also represent the sound ti, which was the Sumerian word for arrow. But ti also meant life and rib, so the same sign could be used to write those words too. This rebus principle, using signs for their sound rather than their meaning, was revolutionary. It meant you could write anything, any word in the language, even abstract concepts that had no physical form, and crucially, they began to represent not just objects but sounds, syllables, that could be combined to write any word in the Sumerian language. This was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, spoken language could be fully recorded, preserved, transmitted across distance and time. You could write a letter to someone far away. You could record a law code that everyone had to follow. You could compose poetry and literature that would survive beyond your lifetime. Writing changed everything about human society. By 3,500 years before the Common Era, true cities had emerged. Uruk, the largest and most famous, covered 6 square kilometers and housed perhaps 50,000 people, an almost incomprehensible number for that era. Lagash, Nippur, Eridu, Kish, each grew into substantial urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands. They weren't just big villages. They were complex societies with monumental architecture, organized religion, professional armies, and most crucially, writing. Cuneiform script, invented by the Sumerians around 3,200 years before the Common Era, began as simple pictographs pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. A picture of a head meant head. A picture of a bowl meant bowl. But over time, these pictures became more abstract, more stylized, evolving into the wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform. And crucially, they began to represent not just objects, but sounds, syllables that could be combined to write any word in the Sumerian language. This was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, spoken language could be fully recorded, preserved, transmitted across distance and time. Writing changed everything. It allowed for complex administration, for keeping track of resources, debts, laws, and history. Sumerian scribes trained in special schools attached to temples created vast archives of economic documents, legal contracts, literary works, and historical records. These weren't simple schools. Training to become a scribe took years, starting in childhood. Boys, and occasionally girls from wealthy families, would spend their days copying practice texts, memorizing hundreds of cuneiform signs and their various meanings, learning both Sumerian and increasingly Akkadian, studying mathematics and astronomy, copying out classical literature. The education was rigorous and sometimes harsh. We have school texts that are essentially homework exercises, showing students' mistakes corrected by teachers. We have texts listing the punishments for various infractions, usually beatings with a stick. We have compositions written from the student's perspective complaining about the difficulty and the discipline. One famous text, the dialogue between a teacher and a student, shows the teacher berating the student for being lazy and stupid, and the student desperately trying to win favour by bringing gifts and praising the teacher's wisdom. But those who completed the training became members of an elite professional class. Scribes were indispensable to the functioning of civilization. They kept the temple and palace accounts, they recorded legal transactions, they wrote royal inscriptions glorifying their king's deeds, they composed hymns and prayers, they calculated the calendar and predicted eclipses. They administered the law and judged disputes. Being literate in a largely illiterate society gave them power and status. They were the bureaucrats, the administrators, the intellectuals of Sumerian civilization. They wrote on clay tablets which, when dried or baked, became essentially indestructible. Stone crumbles over millennia. Papyrus rots. Parchment decays. Wood burns. But baked clay, especially clay that was accidentally baked by the fires that destroyed the buildings containing them, can last indefinitely. This is why we know so much about Sumer, because their civilization was recorded in a medium that could survive millennia, buried in the ruins of dead cities. It's a strange irony that the very catastrophes that destroyed Sumerian civilization also ensured that we would know about it, because the fires that burned the cities baked the tablets and preserved them. The Sumerian city-states were independent political entities, each ruled by a leader called an ensi, or sometimes a lugal, terms usually translated as governor or king, though the distinction between them is complex and not fully understood. The ensi seems to have been originally a temple administrator, the chief priest or steward who managed the god's property. The lugal, literally meaning big man, seems to have been originally a military leader, someone chosen to command in war who might then hold on to power afterward. Over time, these roles blurred and merged. The ensi became a political ruler, with military and religious authority. Each city had its own patron deity, who theoretically owned the city and its lands. The ziggurats, massive stepped pyramid temples, served as the earthly homes of these gods. The ensi was the god's steward, managing the deity's property on earth and interceding with the divine on behalf of the people. This wasn't just theoretical theology. The ruler really did act as the god's estate manager, organizing agricultural production, collecting rents and taxes on the god's behalf, distributing rations to temple workers. This religious framework undergirded a complex social structure. At the top were the ruling elite, priests and administrators, who controlled vast estates and commanded the labor of thousands. These were wealthy families who lived in large houses, wore fine clothes, ate the best food, and had numerous servants. They were literate, educated in the scribal schools, connected by marriage and business relationships. They formed a tight-knit aristocracy that ran the city-states. Below them were craftspeople, merchants, and scribes, the middle tier of urban society. Craftspeople included metal workers who made bronze tools and weapons, potters who produced the countless clay vessels needed for storage and transport, weavers who turned wool from the temple flocks into textiles, jewelers who made ornaments from imported gold and lapis lazuli, carpenters who built furniture and boats, stonemasons who carved monuments and cylinder seals. These people had valuable skills and could make a decent living, better than farmers certainly, though they'd never be wealthy like the elite. Merchants travelled vast distances, sometimes bringing Sumerian manufactured goods, grain and textiles to foreign lands and returning with the raw materials that Mesopotamia lacked. Cedar wood from Lebanon, copper from Oman, tin from somewhere far to the east, possibly Afghanistan, gold from Egypt or Nubia, carnelian and lapis lazuli from the Indus Valley. These long-distance trade networks connected Sumer to a vast world, bringing exotic goods and foreign ideas. Further down the social ladder were farmers and labourers, the majority of the population who worked the fields and dug the canals. Most were free but poor, owning little beyond their labour. They worked land belonging to the temples or wealthy families, paying rent in the form of a share of the crop or labour on other projects. During the agricultural off-season, they'd be called up for corvée labour, compulsory service on public projects like canal digging, wall building, or ziggurat construction. This was the state's labour tax, and it could be onerous, taking men away from their families for weeks or months at a time. At the bottom were slaves, though slavery in Sumer was not as total or hereditary as it would become in later civilizations. Most slaves were debt slaves. People who'd fallen into debt they couldn't repay and had to work it off. This could happen easily. A bad harvest, an illness, an unexpected expense, and a farming family might have to borrow grain to survive until the next harvest. If they couldn't repay the loan, they'd have to work for the creditor. Sometimes this meant the whole family going into debt slavery. Sometimes parents would sell their children, usually temporarily, to pay off debts or buy food during famines. But slaves could own property, engage in business, and buy their freedom. Slavery wasn't necessarily permanent or even lifelong. It was a social status you could fall into and potentially climb out of. There were also foreign slaves, prisoners of war, who had fewer rights and harder lives, but even they weren't necessarily slaves forever. After a generation or two, their descendants might be integrated into Sumerian society as free but low-status people. Women in Sumerian society occupied a more complex position than in many later Mesopotamian cultures. They could own property, engage in business, and serve in religious roles. Some held positions of considerable power. The Entuar, high priestess of a city, was often a daughter of the ruling family and wielded significant religious and political influence. She was married to the city's patron god in a sacred marriage ceremony, and she lived in the temple complex managing religious rituals and the temple estates. Being an Ontu was one of the few positions where a woman could exercise real power independent of her father or husband. Ordinary women worked in agriculture, textile production, and various crafts. The famous Sumerian beer, which was safer to drink than water and formed a staple of the diet, was primarily brewed by women. Tavern keeping was a woman's profession. Women could be scribes, though it was rare. They could be merchants, conducting business in their own right. They could inherit property and leave it to their children. Legal texts show women appearing in court, making contracts, buying and selling property. They had legal personhood in a way that women in many later cultures would not, but they were not equal to men. A woman's status was largely derived from her relationship to men, as daughter, wife, or widow. Marriage contracts and divorce laws favoured men. Women's sexual behaviour was more strictly controlled than men's. A wife's adultery was a serious crime, sometimes punishable by death. A husband's adultery, provided it wasn't with another man's wife, was not a crime at all. Inheritance usually went through the male line. So Sumerian women had more rights and opportunities than women in many ancient societies, but they still lived in a fundamentally patriarchal world. The Sumerian economy was sophisticated for its time. It was largely a redistributive system centered on the temple and palace complexes. Farmers brought their produce to these central institutions, as taxes or rent on temple-owned land. The institutions then redistributed this produce as rations to workers, as offerings to the gods, and as trade goods. This wasn't a market economy in the modern sense. There was trade, yes, and there were market prices, but the large-scale movements of goods were controlled by institutional redistribution, not by supply and demand. Long-distance trade was extensive. Mesopotamia lacked many basic resources that complex civilization requires: stone for tools and building, timber for roofs and boats, metals for tools and weapons. So Sumerians traded grain, textiles, and manufactured goods for raw materials from the surrounding regions. Trade routes extended up the Euphrates into Syria and Anatolia for timber, silver, and copper. Trade went east into the Zagros Mountains and beyond into the Iranian plateau for tin, lapis lazuli, and other minerals. Trade went south along the Persian Gulf to Dilmun, modern Bahrain, and from there to the Indus Valley for carnelian exotic woods and other luxury goods. Sumerian merchants travelled these routes personally or sent agents. They carried tablets with them, letters of credit and contracts sealed with their personal cylinder seals. These seals were small stone cylinders carved with intricate designs. When rolled across wet clay, they left an impression that served as a signature, a way of authenticating documents in a world where most people couldn't read. The designs were unique to each seal, making them impossible to forge with ancient technology. Seal impressions show up on countless Sumerian tablets, proof that this person authorized this transaction or witnessed this agreement. Warfare was constant. The city-states fought each other endlessly over water rights, agricultural land, and prestige. The earlier notion that Sumerian cities were peaceful theocracies has been thoroughly debunked by both textual and archaeological evidence. They were militaristic societies that maintained professional armies and built massive defensive walls. Every city was surrounded by fortifications, usually a double or triple wall system with towers and gates that could be barricaded shut when enemies approached. The Stele of the Vultures, an early Sumerian monument from around 2,500 years before the Common Era, depicts the city of Lagash's victory over the rival city of Umma in gruesome detail. It shows the king of Lagash leading his phalanx of soldiers, their shields locked together in a wall, trampling the enemy underfoot. The reverse side shows heaps of enemy corpses being devoured by vultures, hence the monument's modern name. This wasn't propaganda exaggerating peaceful people. This was celebrating real warfare that was a constant feature of Sumerian life. Armies consisted of both professional soldiers and militia called up from the general population. The professionals were the elite troops, heavily armed spearmen or axemen who formed the core of the battle line. They wore copper helmets and leather or felt armour, carried large rectangular shields, and fought in tight formations. The militia provided bulk, farmers and labourers given basic weapons, spears or bows, and thrown into battle to overwhelm the enemy with numbers. Chariots appeared later, four-wheeled wagons drawn by donkeys or onagers, carrying a driver and soldiers armed with spears or javelins. These weren't fast or manoeuvrable, but they provided a mobile platform for commanders and elite troops. Wars were fought over tangible resources. The most common cause was water rights. Upstream cities could dam rivers or dig canals that diverted water, depriving downstream cities of irrigation. This was an existential threat that justified war. Other wars were fought over agricultural land, especially the fertile territory between cities that both claimed. Some wars were fought for prestige, to prove which city's god was more powerful, which king more favoured by the gods, and some, especially later when the Akkadians became dominant, were wars of conquest, attempts to create empires by forcing other cities into submission. This constant conflict, however, was also the crucible that would forge the next stage of Mesopotamian civilization, because out of this turbulent world of competing city-states, a man would arise who would unite them all by force and create the world's first true empire. His name was Sargon, and he was not Sumerian. He was Akkadian, a Semitic-speaking people who had been settling in northern Mesopotamia and gradually filtering south. The Akkadians spoke a different language, worshipped some different gods, and came from a different cultural background. But they had been living alongside Sumerians for centuries, trading with them, fighting them, learning from them, intermarrying with them. By the time Sargon appeared on the scene around 2334 years before the Common Era, Akkadian and Sumerian populations were thoroughly intermixed across Mesopotamia. Many cities were bilingual. Scribes learned to write both languages. Sumerian cuneiform could be adapted to write Akkadian, a completely unrelated language, which shows just how flexible and powerful the writing system had become. The cultural boundary was porous. Akkadians worshipped Sumerian gods alongside their own. Sumerians borrowed Akkadian words. Intermarriage was common. In many ways, they were already becoming one people. But politically, the Sumerian city-states still dominated the south, rich and powerful, but also divided and vulnerable. The Akkadian-speaking north was less urbanized, less wealthy, but perhaps more unified, or at least more willing to accept centralized authority. This was the world Sargon set out to conquer, and the conquest would reshape Mesopotamia forever, creating an empire that, while it lasted only a few generations, established the model that all later Mesopotamian states would follow. The Sumerian city-states were independent political entities, each ruled by a leader called an ensi, or sometimes a lugal, terms usually translated as governor or king. Each city had its own patron deity, who theoretically owned the city and its lands. The ziggurats, massive, stepped pyramid temples, served as the earthly homes of these gods. The ensi was the god's steward, managing the deity's property on earth and interceding with the divine on behalf of the people. This religious framework undergirded a complex social structure. At the top were the ruling elite, priests and administrators who controlled vast estates and commanded the labor of thousands. Below them were craftspeople, merchants, and scribes, the middle tier of urban society. Further down were farmers and laborers, the majority of the population, who worked the fields and dug the canals. At the bottom were slaves, though slavery in Sumer was not as total or hereditary as it would become in later civilizations. Debt slavery was common, but slaves could own property and buy their freedom. Women in Sumerian society occupied a more complex position than in many later Mesopotamian cultures. They could own property, engage in business, and serve in religious roles. Some held positions of considerable power. The Entu, high priestess of a city, was often a daughter of the ruling family and wielded significant religious and political influence. Ordinary women worked in agriculture, textile production, and various crafts. The famous Sumerian beer, which was safer to drink than water and formed a staple of the diet, was primarily brewed by women. The Sumerian economy was sophisticated for its time. It was largely a redistributive system centered on the temple and palace complexes. Farmers brought their produce to these central institutions as taxes or rent on temple-owned land. The institutions then redistributed this produce as rations to workers, as offerings to the gods, and as trade goods. Long-distance trade was extensive. Mesopotamia lacked many basic resources: stone, timber, metals, so Sumerians traded grain, textiles, and manufactured goods for raw materials from the surrounding regions. Trade routes extended up into Anatolia for timber and silver, east into the Iranian plateau for lapis lazuli and tin, south along the Persian Gulf to Dilmun, and beyond for copper, gold, and exotic goods. Sumerian merchants travelled vast distances, and foreign merchants came to Sumerian cities. This exchange of goods brought an exchange of ideas, technology, and culture, making Sumer a cosmopolitan civilization connected to a wide world. Warfare was constant. The city-states fought each other endlessly over water rights, agricultural land, and prestige. The earlier notion that Sumerian cities were peaceful theocracies has been thoroughly debunked. They were militaristic societies that maintained professional armies and built massive defensive walls. The Stele of the Vultures, an early Sumerian monument, depicts the city of Lagash's victory over Umma in gruesome detail, showing heaps of enemy corpses being devoured by vultures. War was not an aberration, but a normal state of affairs. This constant conflict, however, was also the crucible that would forge the next stage of Mesopotamian civilization. Because out of this turbulent world of competing city-states, a man would arise who would unite them all by force and create the world's first true empire. His name was Sargon, and he was not Sumerian. He was Akkadian, a Semitic-speaking people who had been settling in northern Mesopotamia and gradually filtering south. The Akkadians spoke a different language, worshipped some different gods, and came from a different cultural background. But they had been living alongside Sumerians for centuries, trading with them, fighting them, learning from them. By the time Sargon appeared on the scene, around 2334 years before the Common Era, Akkadian and Sumerian populations were thoroughly intermixed across Mesopotamia. Many cities were bilingual. Scribes learned to write both languages. The cultural boundary was porous, but politically the Sumerian city-states still dominated the south, rich and powerful, but also divided and vulnerable. This was the world Sargon set out to conquer. The Akkadian conquest of Sumer was not a sudden invasion by foreign barbarians. It was more like a hostile takeover by a rival Mesopotamian power that happened to speak a different language. Sargon himself was a man of mysterious origins. Later legend claimed he was born to a priestess who set him adrift in a basket on the Euphrates, only to be found and raised by a gardener. This is almost certainly mythical, modelled on later hero legends. What we know for certain is that he rose to become cupbearer to the king of Kish, then somehow seized power, founded a new city called Akkad, and launched a series of military campaigns that would change Mesopotamia forever. The Akkadian conquest, Sargon's empire, Sargon of Akkad. Even the name carries weight across 43 centuries. Sharaken in Akkadian, meaning the true king or the legitimate king, though whether that was his birth name or a throne name he adopted is unknown. He was the first empire builder in recorded history, the first man to unite multiple city-states under a single authority through military conquest and centralized administration. Before Sargon, rulers called themselves King of Uruk or King of Kish or King of Lagash. Sargon called himself King of Akkad, King of Kish, King of the land, and eventually King of the Four Quarters, meaning ruler of the entire world as the Mesopotamians understood it. His origins are murky, wrapped in legend. Later Mesopotamian texts claim he was born to a high priestess who, forbidden to bear children due to her religious vows, set him adrift in a reed basket coated with bitumen on the Euphrates River. A gardener or water drawer named Aki found the basket and raised the child. Young Sargon worked as a gardener, then somehow entered the service of Ur-Zababa, king of Kish, rising to the position of cupbearer. The cupbearer was a trusted official, someone close to the king, and from this position Sargon launched his bid for power. How much of this is true? Probably very little. The basket story is clearly modelled on later hero legends, including the story of Moses in the Hebrew Bible. It's a narrative trope, the humble origins of the great hero found to be abandoned and raised by commoners, only to rise to kingship through his own abilities. The historical Sargon probably came from a reasonably prominent family. You don't become cupbearer to a king from nothing. But he may not have been of royal blood, which would make his rise to kingship irregular, something that needed to be explained and legitimized through origin stories. What we know for certain is that around 2334 years before the Common Era, Sargon seized power in Kish, or perhaps founded a new city nearby called Akkad. The location of Akkad has never been found by archaeologists. It was somewhere in the region of central Mesopotamia, probably near modern Baghdad, but the exact site remains one of archaeology's great mysteries. The city was abandoned in ancient times and its bricks were hauled away for use elsewhere, leaving no visible trace. We know it existed because hundreds of texts mention it, but we can't point to its ruins. From this base, Sargon launched a series of military campaigns that would change Mesopotamia forever. His first major target was Lugalzagizi, king of Uruk, who had managed to unite many southern city-states under his rule and called himself king of the land. Lugalzagizi was powerful, probably the most powerful ruler in Mesopotamia before Sargon appeared. He claimed to have conquered from the Lower Sea, the Persian Gulf, to the Upper Sea, possibly meaning the Mediterranean, though this was likely an exaggeration. Still, he controlled much of southern Mesopotamia and was the obstacle to Sargon's ambitions. The two armies met somewhere near Uruk, in a battle that may be the first documented major conflict between empire-building states. The details are lost, buried in the rubble of millennia. We don't know the size of the armies, though they were probably in the thousands rather than tens of thousands. We don't know the tactics, though Sumerian and Akkadian warfare of this period relied heavily on dense phalanxes of spearmen, their shields locked together, advancing in slow, grinding combat. We don't know how long the battle lasted or how many died. What we know is the outcome. Lugalsagessi was defeated, utterly and completely. Sargon's inscriptions describe how the king of Uruk was captured, brought in a neck stock or yoke like a prisoner, and paraded to the temple of Enlil at Nippur. Nippur was the religious center of Sumer, the city of the chief god Enlil, and bringing your captured enemy there to prostrate before the god was the ultimate statement of victory. It said, "The gods favor me. The gods have given me victory. My rule is legitimate, ordained by heaven. With Lugalsagessi defeated, the Sumerian cities fell one by one. Ur, Lagash, Umma, Adab, each submitted or was conquered." Sargon's inscriptions, carved on stone monuments and preserved in later copies, list his conquest with pride. 50 governors he conquered. All the lands from the lower sea to the upper sea now paid him tribute. He washed his weapons in the Persian Gulf, a traditional ritual gesture signifying complete victory over the south. The heartland of Sumerian civilization, which had existed as independent city-states for over 1,000 years, was now part of an empire ruled by an Akkadian king. But Sargon didn't stop there. He campaigned north into Assyria, conquering cities along the Tigris River. He campaigned west into Syria, possibly reaching as far as the Mediterranean coast, though some historians think these claims were exaggerations. He campaigned east into Elam, the region in southwestern Iran. Later legends claimed he crossed the seas and conquered Dilmun and Magan, lands associated with the Persian Gulf and possibly Oman. How much of this is historical, and how much is legendary is hard to say. What's clear is that Sargon commanded a powerful military machine and used it to expand his control over a vast territory. Ancient inscriptions credit him with conquering 34 cities, a number that might be literal or might be symbolic. In Mesopotamian numerology, certain numbers had special significance. But whether 34 or some other number, Sargon clearly conquered extensively. And crucially, he didn't just raid these cities for loot and leave, he established a system of control, an administrative apparatus that would allow him to rule this vast territory from his capital at Akkad. What made Sargon's empire different from earlier conquests was its administrative sophistication. He installed Akkadian governors in conquered cities, replacing or subordinating local rulers. These governors were loyal to Sargon personally, often members of his extended family or trusted military commanders. They controlled local resources, collected tribute, raised troops when needed, and enforced Sargon's laws. This was a centralized system, with power flowing from the king at the center out to provincial administrators, rather than the loose federations or temporary alliances that had characterized earlier multi-city polities. He established garrisons in strategic locations, military colonies that could respond to rebellions or external threats. He built roads to facilitate communication and troop movement. He created a postal system or courier system, runners who carried messages between the capital and distant provinces, allowing the king to know what was happening in his realm and to issue orders that would be obeyed. This was administrative technology, ways of organizing and controlling large territories, and it was as important as military technology in creating a lasting empire. He standardized weights and measures to facilitate trade and tax collection. Before Sargon, different cities used different standards. A mina of silver in Ur might weigh differently than a mina in Kish. This made long-distance trade complicated and created opportunities for fraud. Sargon imposed uniform standards across his realm, making economic integration possible. Merchants could trade from one end of the empire to the other, knowing that measurements would be consistent, that contracts made in one city would be recognized in another. He made Akkadian the official language of administration, though Sumerian remained dominant in the south, and continued to be used for literature and religious texts. Tablets from Sargon's reign show a bilingual empire. administrative documents in Akkadian, royal inscriptions in both Akkadian and Sumerian, temple records in Sumerian, school texts teaching both languages. Akkadian scribes learned to write Sumerian. Sumerian scribes learned to write Akkadian. The two cultures were fusing. This cultural fusion is one of Sargon's most important legacies. The Akkadians didn't try to erase Sumerian culture. They absorbed it, adopted it, made it their own while maintaining their distinct identity. Akkadian rulers patronized Sumerian temples, rebuilt ziggurats, sponsored Sumerian literature. They portrayed themselves as legitimate heirs to the Sumerian kings who had come before. Royal inscriptions called Sargon King of Kish, a traditional Sumerian title that carried prestige and implied divine favor. In later Mesopotamian tradition, King of Kish meant universal ruler, someone who ruled not just one city but all cities. Sumerian as a spoken language was already in decline, being replaced by Akkadian in daily life. The process had been going on for centuries as Akkadian-speaking peoples settled in Mesopotamia and intermarried with Sumerians. By Sargon's time, much of the population was probably bilingual, speaking Akkadian at home and in the market, but learning Sumerian in school for religious and literary purposes. But Sargon's empire accelerated this shift by making Akkadian the language of power and administration. If you wanted to work for the government, if you wanted to trade across long distances, if you wanted to communicate with the royal court, you needed to know Akkadian. Yet Sumerian remained the language of scholarship, religion, and high culture. Scribes still copied out Sumerian literary texts. Temples still used Sumerian for rituals. Learned people still studied Sumerian classics. It became like Latin in medieval Europe or Sanskrit in India, a dead spoken language that remained alive as a scholarly and religious language. This cultural fusion, creating what we might call Sumero-Akkadian civilization, would define Mesopotamia for the next 2,000 years. Even when Sumerian was completely dead as a spoken tongue, even when no one's native language was Sumerian, scribes still studied it, and texts were still composed in it. Sargon ruled for 56 years according to the Sumerian king list, an extraordinarily long reign for any period of history, but especially for the violent world of the ancient Near East. He died of natural causes, apparently, and was succeeded by his son Rimush. The succession was not smooth. Revolts broke out across the empire. Many of the Sumerian cities that Sargon had conquered saw the change of king as an opportunity to reassert independence. Elam rebelled. Cities in Syria broke away. Rimush spent much of his 9-year reign putting down revolts and reconquering territories his father had won, and then Rimush was murdered, killed in a palace conspiracy. The exact circumstances are unclear, but it seems he was assassinated by his own courtiers, possibly his brother. Manishtusu, Sargon's other son, took the throne, and also spent his reign fighting revolts and campaigning to maintain the empire. After 15 years, he too was killed, again by palace conspirators. The Akkadian Empire was powerful, but it was also unstable, held together by military force and the personal authority of the king. When that authority weakened during succession crises, the empire nearly fell apart. The Akkadian Empire reached its zenith not under Sargon but under his grandson, Naram-Sin, who ruled from 2261 to 2218 years before the Common Era. Naram-Sin went further than Sargon had dared, proclaiming himself a god while still alive. This was unprecedented in Mesopotamian kingship. Kings were supposed to be chosen by the gods, divinely appointed intermediaries between human and divine. But they were still human. They served the gods. They would die and face judgment in the afterlife like everyone else. Naram-Sin changed that. He had his name written with the divine determinative, the symbol that preceded the names of gods in cuneiform texts. He commissioned monuments showing him wearing the horned crown that was the symbol of divinity, showing him larger than life, towering over both his soldiers and his enemies. The most famous of these is the victory stele of Naram-Sin, a limestone monument over 6 feet tall discovered in Susa, where it had been carried as plunder by Elamite conquerors centuries later. The stele shows Naram-Sin climbing a mountain toward 2 stars or suns at the summit, symbols of the gods who favour him. He's wearing the horned crown and carrying weapons. His enemies are trampled beneath his feet, falling from the mountain impaled on spears. His own soldiers climb behind him in ordered ranks, disciplined and victorious. The inscription describes his victories over a coalition of rebellious cities and foreign peoples. It lists 9 kings who rose against him, and how he defeated them all. It calls him King of the 4 Quarters, Master of all creation. This deification was a political statement. It said Naram-Sin's authority came not from election by city assemblies or appointment by the gods, but from his own divine nature. He was not just the god's chosen instrument, he was a god himself. This made rebellion not just illegal, but sacrilegious. It made his commands literally the will of heaven. It was an attempt to solve the legitimacy problem that had plagued his father and uncle, to make the empire's foundations less dependent on personal loyalty and military force, more on religious obedience. Whether it worked is questionable. Naram-Sin still faced rebellions, still had to campaign constantly to maintain control. But he was more successful than his predecessors at expanding the empire and holding it together. He campaigned deep into the Zagros Mountains, defeating coalitions of mountain peoples who raided the lowlands. He conquered territories in Syria and Anatolia. He reasserted control over Elam. He built a royal residence at Tel Brak in northeastern Syria, a massive administrative centre to control that region. For a brief moment, the Akkadian Empire seemed stable, a new order that might last. But then Naram-Sin died, and his son Shar-Kali-Shari inherited a realm already showing cracks. The year names from Shar-Kali-Shari's reign tell a story of constant crisis. In ancient Mesopotamia, years weren't numbered consecutively like we do. Instead, each year was named after a significant event that happened during it, often a military victory or temple construction. The year the king captured the city of X, the year the temple of Y was founded. Reading these year names is like reading a chronicle of the reign, and Shar-Kali-Shari's year names are almost all about wars and disasters. Year 2, the year that Sharlag, king of Gutium, was captured. Year 5, the year that Gutium was defeated for a second time. Year 6, the year that the foundations of Babylon's temple were laid, a rare peaceful achievement amid constant warfare. Year after year, wars against Gutians, Elamites, Amorites, wars against rebellious Sumerian cities. The empire was under siege from all sides, and Shar-Kali-Shari was fighting a losing battle to hold it together. Revenue from distant provinces dried up as regions asserted independence or stopped paying tribute. The standing army, which had to be fed and paid from the central treasury, became unsustainable as income declined. And then there were the Gutians. These mysterious people from the Zagros Mountains to the east had been mentioned in Akkadian inscriptions before, usually as defeated enemies or as sources of tribute. But now they were coming down from the highlands in greater numbers, and they weren't just trading or paying tribute. They were raiding, hitting trade routes and isolated settlements, disrupting the agricultural hinterland that fed the cities. As the Akkadian state weakened, the Gutian raids became more frequent, more daring, more destructive. Contemporary texts describe them in the harshest terms. The Curse of Agade, a Sumerian literary composition written after the empire's fall, portrays the Gutians as divine punishment for Naram-Sin's sins. According to this text, Naram-Sin destroyed the Eka temple of Enlil at Nippur during a rebuilding project, disrespecting the chief god and bringing down divine wrath on Akkad. The text says Enlil brought the Gutians down from the mountains as punishment, describing them as people who do not resemble other people, who are not reckoned as part of the land, who have human intelligence but canine instincts and monkey's features. Like small birds, they swooped on the ground in great flocks, the text says. Because of Enlil, they stretched their arms out across the plain like a net for animals. Nothing escaped their clutches. No one left their grasp. Messengers no longer travelled the highways. The courier's boat no longer passed along the rivers. The Gutians drove the trusty goats of Enlil out of their folds and compelled their herdsmen to follow them. They drove the cows out of their pens and compelled their cowherds to go with them. Trade stopped. Communication broke down. The roads became unsafe, the rivers were controlled by bandits, the fabric of civilization was tearing apart. This is propaganda, of course. It was written by Sumerian scribes after Akkad had fallen, and they wanted to explain the catastrophe in theological terms that made sense within their worldview. The gods had ordained it. Akkad had sinned. The Gutians were punishment. This preserved Sumerian pride, you see, because it meant they hadn't just been conquered by a superior enemy. They'd been punished by the gods, which is entirely different. And it would have resonated with a Mesopotamian audience because this is how they understood disasters. Nothing happened by chance. Everything was the will of the gods. But propaganda often contains kernels of truth wrapped in theological interpretation. The Gutians probably did raid extensively. They probably did disrupt trade and communication. They probably did contribute to the breakdown of order. Whether they caused the empire's collapse or just took advantage of it is harder to say. Probably both. A weak, divided, crisis-ridden state is vulnerable to external predators who might not have been able to challenge it at full strength. What made Sargon's empire different from earlier conquests was its administrative sophistication. He didn't just raid cities for loot and leave. He installed Akkadian governors, established garrisons, built roads, created a postal system for communication between the capital and distant provinces. He standardized weights and measures to facilitate trade and tax collection. He made Akkadian the official language of administration, though Sumerian remained dominant in the south and continued to be used for literature and religious texts. Sargon's empire was bilingual and bicultural in a way that prefigured later multi-ethnic empires. Sumerian scribes taught Akkadian students. Akkadian rulers patronized Sumerian religious institutions. The cultures fused, creating what we might call Sumero-Akkadian civilization, a synthesis that would define Mesopotamia for the next 2,000 years. Sumerian as a spoken language was already in decline, being replaced by Akkadian in daily life, but it remained the language of scholarship, religion, and high culture, much like Latin in medieval Europe. The Akkadian Empire reached its zenith under Sargon's grandson Naram-Sin, who ruled from 2261 to 2218 years before the Common Era. Naram-Sin went further than Sargon, proclaiming himself a god while still alive, something unprecedented in Mesopotamian kingship. He had his name written with the divine determinative, a symbol reserved for gods. He commissioned monuments showing him wearing the horned crown of divinity, towering over his enemies and his own soldiers. The most famous of these is the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, a limestone monument over 6 feet tall showing the god-king trampling his enemies underfoot while climbing a mountain toward the sun. The inscription describes his victories over rebellious cities and foreign peoples. Naram-Sin claimed to have defeated a coalition of 9 kings who rose against him, putting down massive revolts and expanding the empire even further than his grandfather had. For a brief moment, it seemed the Akkadian Empire had achieved stability, a new order that would last. But empires built on military conquest are inherently unstable. They require constant campaigning to maintain authority, constant tribute to support the armies, constant vigilance against rebellion. And they're vulnerable to any weakness at the center, any disruption to the military and economic systems that hold them together. The Akkadian Empire was no exception. After Naram-Sin's death, his son Shar-Kali-Shari inherited a realm already showing cracks. The year names from Shar-Kali-Shari's reign tell a story of constant crisis. Year 2, the year that the king of Gutium was captured. Year 5, the year that Gutium was defeated. Year 6, the year that the 4 quarters of the world were taken by arms. Year after year, wars against Gutians, Elamites, Amorites, internal revolts in Sumerian cities. Shar-Kali-Shari was fighting on multiple fronts, and the strain was showing. Revenue from distant provinces dried up as regions asserted independence. The standing army, which had to be fed and paid, became a drain rather than an asset. And then there were the Gutians, nomadic people from the Zagros Mountains to the east. They began as raiders, hitting trade routes and isolated settlements. But as the empire weakened, their raids became more frequent, more daring, more destructive. They weren't trying to conquer and hold territory at first. They were taking advantage of chaos to loot and plunder, but eventually, as Akkadian authority collapsed, they moved into the power vacuum. Contemporary texts describe them in the harshest terms. The Curse of Agad, a Sumerian literary composition written after the empire's fall, portrays the Gutians as something less than human. It says Enlil, the chief Sumerian god, brought them down from the mountains as punishment for Naram-Sin's sins against the gods. It describes them as people with human intelligence but canine instincts and monkey's features, as unbridled people who do not resemble other people, who are not reckoned as part of the land. They stretched their arms out across the plain like a net for animals, the text says. Nothing escaped their clutches, no one left their grasp. This is propaganda, of course, written by Sumerian scribes who wanted to explain their own civilization's collapse, in terms that preserved Sumerian moral superiority. The Gutians left no written records of their own, so we only have these hostile accounts. But propaganda often contains kernels of truth wrapped in exaggeration. The Gutians probably were semi-nomadic, probably did engage in raiding, probably did contribute to the breakdown of order. Whether they were the primary cause of the empire's collapse or just one factor among many is still debated by historians. Archaeological evidence points to additional factors. Climate data from the period shows a severe drought, part of what geologists call the 4.2 kilo-year event, a dramatic aridification that affected the entire Middle East around 2200 years before the Common Era. This would have caused crop failures, famine, population displacement, and social unrest. Northern Mesopotamia, which relied on rainfall agriculture, was hit particularly hard. Southern Mesopotamia's irrigation agriculture was more resilient but still affected as rivers ran lower and fields became harder to water. Economic texts from the period show grain prices skyrocketing and rations being cut. People were starving. Starving people don't pay taxes and can't serve in armies. They rebel. They migrate. They turn to banditry. A state trying to maintain a military empire in the midst of the environmental catastrophe and widespread famine is a state on the verge of collapse. Add external enemies to the mix, and the outcome becomes inevitable. The Akkadian Empire didn't fall in a single dramatic moment. It eroded over decades. Provinces became independent. Cities stopped sending tribute. The Akkadian heartland shrank back to just the area around the capital, and then even that was lost. Akkad itself, the great city founded by Sargon, was abandoned and has never been found by archaeologists. It vanished so completely that we don't even know exactly where it was. This tells you something about the totality of the collapse. By around 2150 years before the Common Era, the Akkadian Empire was finished. What followed was a period often called the Gutian period, though how much actual control the Gutians exercised is unclear. The Sumerian king list, a later document chronicling the succession of kingship in Mesopotamia, lists 21 Gutian kings with suspiciously short and uniform reign lengths, suggesting these might not be accurate historical records, but rather a symbolic way of saying foreign barbarians ruled, and it was a dark time. Certainly, life in Mesopotamia during this period became harder. Archaeological evidence shows decline in many settlements, breakdown of long-distance trade, and general impoverishment. The elaborate administrative apparatus of the Akkadian state collapsed. Fewer records were kept or have survived. Cities still functioned, but at a lower level of complexity and prosperity. Some Sumerian cities even maintained independence under local rulers who resisted Gutian authority. Gudea of Lagash, for example, ruled his city-state successfully during this period and left numerous inscriptions and statues. But the overall picture is one of fragmentation and decline. The first great attempt at empire had failed, brought down by overextension, environmental stress, and external pressure. Mesopotamia broke apart into competing small states. It seemed like the brief experiment in unification was over, that the region would revert permanently to its pattern of warring city-states. Except that wasn't what happened, because out of this dark period would come a revival, a Sumerian renaissance that would actually surpass the Akkadian Empire in administrative sophistication and economic power. This was the third dynasty of Ur, the last great Sumerian kingdom, and its story is crucial to understanding the final catastrophe that the tablets record. The Sumerian Revival Dynasty. Around 2115 years before the Common Era, a Sumerian king from the city of Uruk named Utu-Hegel rose up against the Gutians. His inscriptions describe a campaign against the Gutian king Tiragun, portraying it as a liberation of Sumer from foreign oppressors. Utu-Hegel called the Gutians fanged snakes of the mountain ranges, a people who acted violently against the gods, who took Sumer's kingship to the mountains, who filled Sumer with wickedness. He drove them out in a series of battles and proclaimed the restoration of Sumerian rule. Utu-Hegel's victory was short-lived. He reigned only 7 years before drowning in a canal accident, or possibly being assassinated depending on which source you believe. But his general, Ur-Nammu, took up the cause and established a new dynasty based in the city of Ur. This became known as the Third Dynasty of Ur, or Ur-the-Thwi, one of the best documented periods in ancient Mesopotamian history, thanks to the massive archives of administrative tablets that survived from this time. Ur-Nammu and his successors didn't just restore Sumerian power. They created a highly centralized state that in many ways surpassed the Akkadian Empire in organizational complexity. Where Sargon had ruled through military force and personal charisma, the kings of Ur-the-Thwi built an elaborate bureaucracy that recorded everything. Tens of thousands of administrative texts from this period have been discovered, giving us an almost day-by-day picture of how the state functioned. The economy was centrally planned and controlled to a degree that wouldn't be seen again until modern totalitarian states. The bala system, a rotating obligation, required provincial cities to support the central government at Ur for set periods each year, providing goods, labour and personnel. Everything was counted, recorded, tracked. If a sheep died at the edge of the empire, as one modern scholar quipped, it was noted in the records. This obsessive bureaucratization created massive documentation, which is why we know so much about Ur-3, but it also created a rigid, brittle system that couldn't easily adapt to disruption. The second king of the dynasty, Shulgi, who ruled for 46 years from around 2094 to 2047 years before the Common Era, was the true architect of this system. He standardized the calendar, weights and measures, and administrative procedures across the realm. He reformed the army, creating a professional standing force. He claimed to be literate, an unusual boast for a king, and patronized literature and the arts. Hymns praising Shulgi portray him as the ideal king, warrior and scholar, administrator and builder, beloved of the gods. Under Shulgi, the Ur-3 state expanded through military conquest, incorporating much of southern and central Mesopotamia. He campaigned east into Elam, conquering the city of Susa and bringing it under direct Sumerian control. He built a fortification system along the northeastern frontier, a series of walls and forts intended to keep out nomadic raiders from the highlands. For a time, it worked. The Ur-3 period saw relative stability and prosperity, at least for the ruling class and urban population. Culture flourished. This was the era when much of Sumerian literature as we know it was composed or compiled. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though based on earlier traditions, took its classic Sumerian form during this period. Religious hymns, lamentations, wisdom literature, school texts for training scribes, all were produced in vast quantities. Sumerian was becoming a dead spoken language, replaced in daily life by Akkadian, but it remained the language of scholarship and high culture. Scribes trained in special schools, learning to write in both Sumerian and Akkadian, mastering cuneiform in all its complexity. The ziggurat of Ur, one of the best preserved ancient structures in Iraq, was built during this period. It rose in 3 massive tiers to a height of over 5 meters, topped by a temple to Nana, the moon god who was Ur's patron deity. The structure was made of mud brick, as was all Mesopotamian architecture, but faced with baked brick and bitumen to protect it from weather. Standing at its base, you can still feel the scale and ambition of the project. This was a civilization at its height, confident in its power and its future. But beneath this prosperity, weaknesses were accumulating. The centralized bureaucratic system was efficient but inflexible. It required constant oversight, constant communication, constant flow of resources to the capital. Any disruption to this flow caused problems that cascaded through the entire system. The military campaigns of Shulgi and his successors were expensive and required constant tribute to maintain. Frontier defences had to be garrisoned and supplied. The bureaucracy itself consumed enormous resources. More fundamentally, the environment was changing. The irrigation agriculture that supported Mesopotamian civilization had a fatal flaw: salinization. When you irrigate in a hot, dry climate, water evaporates from the soil, leaving behind dissolved salts. Over centuries or millennia, these salts accumulate until the soil becomes too salty to support crops. This process was already underway in southern Mesopotamia during the Earthrud period. Agricultural texts show farmers switching from wheat to barley, which is more salt-tolerant but less nutritious. They show declining yields per unit of land. They show fields being taken out of production because they'd become too saline. This was a slow-motion environmental catastrophe, and there was no real solution given their technology. Moving to fresh land wasn't an option, because all the suitable land was already under cultivation. Flushing the soil with massive amounts of water might have helped, but that required more water than was available and risked flooding and other problems. So the agricultural base that supported the Earth-3 state was slowly eroding. In good years with normal rainfall and river levels, the system could handle it, but it was becoming less resilient, less able to absorb shocks, and shocks were coming. The climate was changing again, becoming drier. The rivers ran lower. Rainfall in the north decreased. Food production began to decline just as the administrative state demanded ever more resources. Internal problems accumulated. The tablet archives document increasing corruption among officials, disputes over resources, provinces resisting the bailer obligations, mercenary soldiers demanding higher pay. The kings responded with reforms, investigations, and sometimes harsh punishments. But the underlying problems persisted. The system was designed for stability and growth, not for managing decline. External pressures were also mounting. Nomadic groups, particularly the Amorites from the west, were pushing into Mesopotamia in greater numbers. These were Semitic-speaking pastoralists who'd been on the margins of settled areas for centuries. But now they were moving in, sometimes peacefully as labourers and soldiers, sometimes as raiders and invaders. The other kings spent enormous resources trying to keep them out, building walls and forts, launching military expeditions, but you can't wall off an entire frontier, and the Amorites kept coming. To the east, Elam was becoming restless. The Elamites were an ancient people from southwestern Iran, speaking a language unrelated to anything else in the region, with their own distinct culture and traditions. They'd been conquered by the Ur-3 kings and incorporated into the empire as provinces. But they never fully accepted Sumerian rule. They maintained their own identity and waited for opportunities to reassert independence. By the time Ibbi-Sin became king, around 28 years before the Common Era, the Ur-3 state was in serious trouble. He was the 5th king of the dynasty and would be the last. His reign would witness the collapse of everything his predecessors had built, the final end of Sumerian political power, and destruction so complete that it traumatized Mesopotamian collective memory for generations. The tablets from Ibbi-Sin's reign paint a picture of a state in terminal crisis. Letters from provincial governors to the king become increasingly desperate. They report famines, Amorite incursions, cut-offs of communication, requests for military support that can't be fulfilled. The king writes back with orders and reassurances, but his authority is clearly diminishing. Provinces stop sending tribute. Officials defect to rivals. The administrative apparatus that had functioned so smoothly under earlier kings begins to break down. One official, Ishbi-Era, would prove particularly troublesome. He was a general or high administrator from the city of Mari who'd entered the king's service. Ibbi-Sin sent him north to secure grain supplies during a famine. Ishbi-Era accomplished the mission, but then used his control of the grain and his army to establish himself as an independent ruler in the city of Izin. His correspondence with Ibbi-Sin, preserved in later copies, shows a man skillfully playing both sides, professing loyalty while maneuvering for power. Eventually he stopped even pretending to obey the king and founded his own dynasty. This was the context in which the final disaster occurred. With the state weakened by environmental stress, economic crisis, internal rebellion, and external pressure, the Elamites saw their chance. In 20,004 years before the Common Era, an Elamite army led by King Kindatu of the Shimashki dynasty marched on Ur. They may have been allied with Amorite groups. They almost certainly had support from rebellious provinces within the former Ur III territory. The campaign was devastatingly effective. The siege of Ur must have been terrible. The city's massive walls, which had stood for centuries, were breached or scaled. The Elamite army poured in. Archaeological evidence from excavations led by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 30s revealed thick ash layers across the city, collapsed walls, burned buildings, scattered human remains. The scale of destruction was immense. Temples were desecrated, palaces burned, the administrative district destroyed. King Ibisin was captured and taken to Elam as a prisoner, where he vanished from history. The third dynasty of Ur was finished, but Ur was not the only city to fall. The tablets speak of destruction across Sumer. Nippur, the sacred city, was sacked. Uruk burned. Eridu, the ancient holy city where civilization was said to have begun, was abandoned. Lagash, Umma, all the great Sumerian cities suffered. This wasn't just the fall of a dynasty or the end of an empire. This was the near-total destruction of Sumerian civilization, the end of Sumer as an independent political and cultural force. And it's this catastrophe that the tablets we discussed at the beginning document in heart-wrenching detail. The tablets speak, lament for Ur, the lament for Ur, the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, is one of the longest and most moving compositions to survive from ancient Mesopotamia. It exists in multiple copies, some from Ur itself, others from Nippur and other cities, suggesting it was widely read or recited in the centuries after the catastrophe. The text is divided into 11 songs or stanzas of unequal length, totaling over 400 lines of poetry in the Sumerian language. It was composed shortly after the destruction, probably within a generation, when the memory was still raw and the ruins still smouldering. The lament begins by listing the great cities of Sumer and noting that their gods have abandoned them. Enlil has abandoned Nippur, Enki has abandoned Eridu, Inanna has abandoned Uruk. This is a crucial theme in Mesopotamian theology. Cities and nations fell not because the gods were weak, but because they chose to withdraw their protection, usually as punishment for some transgression. The people could not defend themselves without divine support, so the abandonment of the gods meant inevitable destruction was coming. The goddess Ningal, wife of the moon god Nanna and patron deity of Ur, is the main speaker in much of the lament. She describes going before the great gods Anu and Enlil to plead for her city. "Please don't destroy Ur," she begs. "Please don't kill its people. Please don't overturn its divine powers." But the gods refuse her pleas. They have decreed Ur's fate, and their decrees cannot be changed. This is another common theme in Mesopotamian thought. The idea that there are appointed times for the rise and fall of kingdoms, cosmic cycles that even the gods cannot or will not alter. With the gods' decision made, the destruction begins. The text describes it in vivid, visceral terms. A storm is coming, it says, but not a natural storm. This is the storm of Enlil, the judgment of the gods manifested as disaster. The bright sun did not rise. Like a twilight star it dawned. In the land, the sun did not rise. Dense fog veiled the sky. The people could not see each other. The storm raged for a full day, the text says. It destroyed the city. It destroyed the house. It destroyed the cattle pen. It leveled the sheepfold. Then comes the enemy army, compared to a great flood, overwhelming and unstoppable. The people moan. The city weeps. The mother looks away from her daughter. The father turns away from his son. Wives are abandoned. Children are abandoned. Possessions are scattered about. Bodies lie in the streets unburied. The temple is profaned. The ziggurat stands empty. The storehouses are looted. The grain is gone. Famine follows war. The lament spares no details in describing the suffering. The elderly who cannot flee are cut down. Children die of starvation or disease. Women are violated. Men are enslaved and marched away. The protective walls that were supposed to keep the city safe are breached. The gates are smashed open. Blood fills the streets like water during a flood. The sacred groves where people worshipped are cut down. The gardens are trampled. The canals are broken, and the fields become wasteland. Ningal herself describes fleeing her own temple as the enemy approaches. Like a dove in its dwelling, I became frightened. Like a swallow on a rafter, I flew away. Her house, the Akishnugal temple, is desecrated. Foreign soldiers defile the holy places. The treasures accumulated over centuries are stolen or destroyed. The cult statue of Nana himself is carried off as plunder. Without the god's presence, the temple becomes just an empty building. The city's divine protection, its very reason for existence, is gone. The text repeatedly emphasizes the violation of natural and social order. Parents cannot protect their children. The strong cannot defend the weak. The wise have no counsel to give. The craftsmen cannot work their crafts. The merchants cannot trade. All the structures of civilized life collapse. People who wore fine clothes now go naked. Those who ate good food now starve. The rich are impoverished. The powerful are humbled. Death is everywhere, and no one is left to perform the proper burial rites. One of the most powerful passages describes the aftermath. In inside it there is death. Outside it there is death. Inside we are being finished off by famine. Outside we are being finished off by Elamite weapons. In the storehouse is depleted. The fishermen have abandoned the fishing. The farmers have abandoned the fields. The shepherds have abandoned the flocks. Everything that made a functioning city, a living civilization, has stopped. The later sections of the lament shift from description to pleading. The text becomes a series of appeals to Nana and the other gods to return, to restore to rebuild what has been destroyed, restore the city, restore the house, make the destroyed temple rise up again. This is both a prayer and a ritual formula. The lament was probably performed in religious ceremonies after the city was partially resettled, a way of processing collective trauma and petitioning for restoration. Other city laments follow similar patterns. The lament for Sumer and Ur extends the scope beyond just Ur to encompass the destruction of the entire region. The lament for Nippur focuses on the religious center of Sumer and the desecration of Enlil's great temple. The lament for Uruk mourns the city of Gilgamesh and the abandonment of Inanna's temple. Together, these texts create a chorus of grief for a civilization in ruins. What makes these laments particularly valuable as historical sources is their specificity. They're not just generic expressions of mourning. They name specific places, describe specific events, reflect actual historical circumstances. When they talk about famine, we can check that against economic tablets that show grain prices increasing 60-fold. When they talk about enemy armies, we can correlate that with the archaeological evidence of destruction layers in the cities. When they talk about the Elamites, we know from other sources that the Elamites did indeed conquer in 20004 years before the Common Era. But they're also more than just historical documents. They're literature, poetry, religious texts. They're attempting to make sense of incomprehensible disaster through the lens of Sumerian theology and worldview. They're asserting that even in complete defeat and destruction, the gods haven't completely abandoned their people. There's the promise of eventual restoration, of the cycle turning, of the gods returning. This is how humans cope with trauma, by finding meaning in suffering, by believing that catastrophe serves some purpose, that there's hope beyond despair. The laments also reveal the Sumerian understanding of their own civilization. They list what mattered most to them, what they mourned most deeply. Temples and gods first because religion was central to identity. Then family and social bonds, the relationships that make communities possible. Then the material conditions of life, the food and shelter and security that civilization provides. And finally, the cultural practices, the wisdom and learning and traditions that define a people. In losing all of this, the Sumerians understood they were losing themselves. Not just their political independence, not just their prosperity, but their very identity as Sumerians. The language would persist for a while longer as a scholarly language, but Sumerian as a living culture was finished. Within a few generations, the people of southern Mesopotamia would speak only Akkadian, worship in Akkadian, write in Akkadian. Sumerian would become a dead language studied by scribes, like Latin in the Middle Ages or Sanskrit in India. The civilization that invented writing, that built the first cities, that created the first literature, would exist only in ancient texts and crumbling ruins. Environmental and social collapse. The fall of Ur and the destruction of the Ur-Thur state didn't happen in isolation. It was part of a broader environmental and social crisis that had been building for centuries and would reshape Mesopotamia fundamentally. To understand this, we need to talk about irrigation, salt, and what happens when you farm the same land intensively for thousands of years. Southern Mesopotamia's agricultural productivity depended entirely on irrigation. The climate was too hot and dry for rain-fed farming. Water had to be channeled from the Tigris and Euphrates through networks of canals, ditches, and distributaries to fields that might be kilometers from the rivers. This required enormous investment in infrastructure and constant maintenance to keep the canals flowing, prevent silting, and manage water levels. The system worked brilliantly for millennia. It's what allowed cities of tens of thousands of people to exist in a desert. But it had a fatal flaw that the Sumerians couldn't solve with their technology. When water evaporates from irrigated fields, it leaves behind the salts that were dissolved in it. Over time, over centuries, these salts accumulate in the soil. At first, the effect is minimal, but eventually the concentration reaches levels that damage crops. Salt interferes with plants' ability to absorb water and nutrients. Yields decline. Eventually, nothing will grow at all. Modern farmers deal with salinization through drainage systems that flush salts down below the root zone, or by periodically flooding fields with massive amounts of water to leach the salts away, or simply by abandoning salinized land and farming elsewhere. The Sumerians tried various strategies, but they were limited by their technology and by the fact that they'd already been farming all the suitable land for generations. One strategy was switching to more salt-tolerant crops. Agricultural texts from the Ur-3 period show exactly this happening. Earlier texts list wheat as a major crop. Later texts show barley becoming increasingly dominant. Barley tolerates salt better than wheat, but provides less nutritional value per unit of land. This was an adaptation, but it was also a sign of declining soil quality. Another strategy was fallowing, leaving fields unplanted for a season or more to let them recover. But fallow fields don't produce food, and the state needed maximum production to support the population and the administrative apparatus, so there was constant pressure to keep farming marginal lands that should have been rested. The long-term trend was unmistakable. Agricultural productivity per unit of land was declining across southern Mesopotamia. Some estimates suggest yields fell by half or more between the early Sumerian period and the end of Ur-3. This meant more. Labour had to be invested to produce the same amount of food. It meant less surplus available to support non-farming activities. It meant vulnerability to any disruption in food supply. When famine hit during Ibisin's reign, the system couldn't cope. Normally, the centralized storage and redistribution system managed local shortages by moving grain from surplus areas to deficit areas. But when shortages were widespread, when the whole region was affected simultaneously, there was no reserve to draw on. Prices skyrocketed. The tablets record grain costing 60 times its normal price. That's not inflation in the modern sense. That's scarcity so severe that people are literally starving. A text from the period, a letter from a provincial governor to the king, describes the situation. The Amorites are raiding the countryside, he reports. Farmers can't work their fields for fear of being killed or captured. Trade routes are cut off. Grain can't be transported safely. The cities are full of refugees from the countryside. Food stocks are exhausted. People are dying. Please send military support. Please send supplies. The king's response, if there was one, hasn't survived. But the overall context suggests there was little help to give. Starvation on this scale has cascading effects. Weakened, malnourished people are more susceptible to disease. Epidemics can sweep through packed urban populations. Social order breaks down as desperate people do desperate things. Crime increases. Local strongmen seize control. Central authority means less and less. Armies can't be fed or paid, so they desert or turn to banditry themselves. The administrative state, which depends on consistent revenue and communication, simply stops functioning. This was the situation when the Elamites attacked. Ur was already weakened by internal crisis before a single Elamite soldier approached the walls. The siege may have lasted months, but the outcome was probably never in doubt. A starving city with no prospect of relief, with much of its population already dead or fled, with its king unable to project power beyond the immediate vicinity, could not mount an effective defense. After the fall, southern Mesopotamia underwent a dramatic demographic shift. People abandoned the southern cities in large numbers and moved north. This northward migration shows up clearly in the archaeological record. Sites in the south show abandonment or severe population decline in the early 2nd millennium years before the Common Era. Sites in central and northern Mesopotamia show growth. The population was moving away from the salinized soils and depleted resources of the far south toward regions that still had agricultural potential. This migration was not just a relocation, it was a cultural transformation. The people who moved north were increasingly Akkadian-speaking rather than Sumerian-speaking. The new centers of power, cities like Isin, Lhasa, Babylon, would be Akkadian cities, not Sumerian ones. Sumerian as a living language was finished. Within a century or two, no one spoke Sumerian as their native tongue. It survived only as a learned language studied by scribes, used in religious rituals much like Latin after the fall of Rome. The Amorites, those Semitic-speaking pastoralists who'd been pushing into Mesopotamia for generations, became the dominant element in the new power structure. Amorite chieftains established themselves as rulers in many cities. The dynasty that would eventually unify Mesopotamia under Babylon, culminating in the famous King Hammurabi, was Amorite in origin. So in a sense, the destruction of Ur and the Sumerian cities opened the way for a new phase of Mesopotamian civilization, one that would be more Semitic than Sumerian in character. But the Amorites also absorbed much of Sumero-Akkadian culture. They adopted cuneiform writing, Mesopotamian gods and religious practices, Mesopotamian legal traditions and administrative techniques. They learned from scribes who'd been trained in the old traditions. So while Sumerian political power was gone and Sumerian language was dying, Sumerian cultural influence persisted. It's a pattern that would repeat throughout history, conquerors adopting the culture of the conquered, civilization outlasting the nations that created it. The environmental degradation, however, continued. Salinization was irreversible in most of the affected areas. Much of southern Mesopotamia would never again support the dense populations it had during the Sumerian period. The center of Mesopotamian civilization shifted permanently northward, to regions around Babylon and later Assyria. Southern cities like Ur limped on for centuries as much smaller settlements, but their glory days were over. Some archaeologists and historians see this as a cautionary tale about the limits of ancient technology and the dangers of environmental degradation. The Sumerians, for all their innovations, couldn't solve the fundamental problem of soil salinization. They pushed their environment to its limits, extracted maximum productivity for centuries, and eventually hit the wall. Climate change and warfare provided the immediate shocks that brought down the system, but the underlying vulnerabilities were environmental. Others emphasized the social and political factors, the rigidity of their bureaucratic state, the costs of militarism, the conflicts between central authority and local autonomy, the tensions between settled farmers and nomadic pastoralists. From this perspective, the Sumerian collapse was primarily a failure of governance, an inability to adapt to changing circumstances, to build a flexible system that could absorb shocks rather than shattering under stress. Both views have merit. Environmental and social factors are intertwined. A more resilient political system might have managed environmental stress better, implementing reforms, relocating population, shifting to different economic strategies. But environmental limits constrain what's possible politically. When the fundamental resource base is eroding, when agricultural productivity is declining, when population is outstripping carrying capacity, no amount of administrative competence can prevent crisis forever. What's undeniable is that the combination of factors proved fatal. Sumerian civilization, which had endured for over 1,500 years, which had survived the Akkadian conquest and the Gutian invasion, which had rebuilt itself into a more powerful state than ever before under Ur III, finally collapsed completely under the weight of environmental stress, economic crisis, and military defeat. And the tablets recording this catastrophe, the lamentations and administrative texts and letters, give us an unprecedented window into how it happened. They show us a civilization aware of its own decline, struggling against it, ultimately overwhelmed by it. They show us human beings facing the collapse of everything they knew, trying to understand why, trying to make sense of incomprehensible disaster, trying to preserve some record for whoever might come after. They show us that the fall of civilizations is not abstract or distant, it's personal. It's the mother who can't feed her child. It's the farmer fleeing his fields. It's the scribe recording the price of grain. It's the priestess watching her temple burn. It's the king taken captive to a foreign land. Legacy and conclusion. So what happened to the Sumerians? After the fall of Ur and the destruction of the Earth estate in 20,004 years before the Common Era, Sumerian civilization as a distinct political and cultural entity effectively ended. The cities were not completely abandoned. Ur itself would be partially resettled and would remain inhabited for centuries, but never again as a major power. Nippur continued as a religious centre, sacred to all later Mesopotamian peoples, but these were shadows of their former glory. The immediate aftermath saw the rise of what historians call the Isin-Lhasa period, named after two Amorite dynasties that competed for control of southern Mesopotamia. Ishbi-Erra, the ambitious general who'd defected from Yebisin's service, established himself at Izin and claimed to be the legitimate successor to the Ur III kings. He and his successors even adopted the same royal titles, tried to maintain the same administrative systems, and portrayed themselves as restorers of Sumerian civilization. In reality, they controlled far less territory and wielded far less power than the Ur III kings had. The dynasty of Lhasa, established by an Amorite ruler named Naplanum, became Isin's chief rival. For over a century, the two dynasties fought for supremacy in southern Mesopotamia, neither able to achieve complete victory. Other cities maintained varying degrees of independence. Babylon, still a relatively minor city at this point, was ruled by its own Amorite dynasty. Central authority had fragmented, but culturally there was continuity. Scribes continued to train in both Sumerian and Akkadian. Sumerian texts were still copied, studied, and revered as classics. The literature of the Old Sumerian and Ur III periods became canonical, much like Greek and Roman classics would later become in Western education. Temples continued to use Sumerian for religious rituals long after no one spoke it as a native language. The legal traditions, the mathematical and astronomical knowledge, the architectural styles, all persisted. This is how cultures actually survive. Not through political continuity, which is fragile and temporary, but through transmission of knowledge, practices, and values to successor cultures. The Sumerians influenced the Akkadians, who influenced the Babylonians, who influenced the Assyrians, who influenced the Persians, who influenced the Greeks, who influenced the Romans, who influenced medieval Europe. It's a chain of cultural transmission stretching from ancient Sumer to the modern world. Modern scholars debate how much of what we think of as Western civilization actually originates in Sumer. Writing, obviously. The wheel. Organized religion with priesthoods and temples, law codes, mathematics based on the sexagesimal system, which is why we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle. Astronomy that tracked planetary movements and predicted eclipses. Epic poetry. Urban planning. Bureaucratic administration. International diplomacy. Warfare with organized armies. The list goes on. Some scholars argue for direct influence, pointing to specific borrowings and adaptations. Others emphasize independent invention and convergent development. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Certainly much was invented independently in different places at different times. But Sumer was first for many things, and being first mattered. It meant that Sumerian solutions to problems, Sumerian ways of organizing society, Sumerian cultural forms became templates that later civilizations could adopt, adapt, or reject. The tablets we've been discussing, the lamentations and administrative texts and historical records, are themselves part of this legacy. They weren't just documents of a dead civilization. They were studied by later Mesopotamian scribes who saw in Sumer's fate a warning and a lesson. The laments influenced later Mesopotamian literature. The tradition of city laments, poems mourning destroyed cities, continued for centuries. When Babylon fell to the Hittites in the 16th century, years before the Common Era, scribes composed a lament for Babylon modelled on the lament for Ur. Even more remarkably, the genre influenced biblical literature. The Book of Lamentations in the Hebrew Bible, which mourns the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 years before the Common Era, follows the same structure and uses similar imagery to the Sumerian city laments composed 1500 years earlier. Some scholars argue this is direct influence, that Hebrew scribes knew the Mesopotamian tradition. Others say it's just parallel development, people responding to similar trauma in similar ways. Either way, it shows how Sumerian literary forms shaped the broader ancient Near Eastern cultural world. The scientific legacy is equally impressive. Sumerian mathematics and astronomy formed the foundation for later Babylonian achievements in these fields. The Babylonians, inheriting and building on Sumerian knowledge, developed sophisticated mathematical astronomy that could predict celestial events with remarkable accuracy. This knowledge eventually passed to the Greeks, who combined it with their own philosophical and geometric traditions to create the foundation of Western science. But perhaps the most important legacy is simply the demonstration that civilization is possible, that humans can create complex, organized societies with writing, law, art, and learning, that we can build cities, grow enough food to support non-farming populations, develop specialized crafts and professions, accumulate and transmit knowledge across generations. Sumer proved it could be done. Every civilization since has built on that proof. The tablets also teach us about fragility. Civilizations, even successful ones, even innovative ones, can collapse. Environmental degradation, climate change, warfare, economic stress, administrative failure, any or all of these can bring down complex societies. The collapse is often sudden from a historical perspective, though it may unfold over decades or generations from the perspective of those living through it. And the human cost is immense, not just in lives lost, but in knowledge, culture, and possibilities erased. The Sumerians didn't know they were the first civilization. They thought they'd always been there, that their cities were eternal, that their way of life was ordained by the gods. They were wrong, as we now know. Their civilization had a beginning, a rise, a golden age, a decline, and an end. This pattern, this arc, would be repeated countless times throughout history. Civilizations rise and fall. The specifics vary, but the pattern persists. What makes the Sumerian case particularly poignant is that we have their own words. We don't have to imagine what the fall felt like. We can read what they wrote as it was happening. We can see the grain prices rising in the economic tablets. We can read the desperate letters from officials to their king. We can experience through their poetry the grief and horror of witnessing their world destroyed. They preserved this not because they knew future scholars would find it fascinating, but because recording was what they did. They were a literate civilization. They wrote everything down, and in doing so, they left us an incomparable gift, a detailed, intimate portrait of a civilization in its final days. Modern archaeology has confirmed much of what the tablets describe. The destruction layers in the cities, the evidence of burning and warfare, the population collapse and northward migration, the environmental degradation, all of it shows up in the physical record. The tablets weren't exaggerating. If anything, the laments may understate the horror because they're trying to fit it into a theological framework that makes some kind of sense. The reality was probably worse, more chaotic, more arbitrary than any poetry can capture. Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur in the 1920s and 30s provide the archaeological evidence. Woolley, working for the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, conducted systematic excavations across the ancient city. He uncovered the royal cemetery with its spectacular grave goods, the ziggurat, residential areas, the temple precinct, and everywhere, in the layers dating to around 2,000 years before the Common Era, he found evidence of catastrophic destruction. Thick ash layers covered large areas of the city. Buildings had collapsed, their mud brick walls melted by intense fire. Skeletons lay scattered in the streets, people who died violently and been left unburied. The administrative district, where the palace and government offices had stood, was almost completely destroyed. Storage rooms showed signs of looting. Valuable objects were gone, but everyday items lay scattered as if people had fled in panic. The temple complex showed evidence of desecration. Sacred objects had been smashed or stolen. The order and organization that had characterized the Earth-3 state had been replaced by chaos and ruin. Similar destruction layers appear at other cities from the same period. At Nippur, the sacred city, fire destroyed large portions of the temple precinct. At Uruk, the great city of Gilgamesh, ash and rubble mark the end of the Ur-3 occupation. The pattern is consistent across southern Mesopotamia. Around 2,000 years before the Common Era, many cities were violently destroyed, their populations killed or scattered, their buildings reduced to ruins. This wasn't a gradual decline. This was catastrophe. But the tablets provide something archaeology alone cannot, the human experience of that catastrophe. The Lamentations aren't just historical records. They're expressions of grief, attempts to process trauma, efforts to make meaning from disaster. Reading them, even in translation, you feel the weight of loss, the depth of despair, but also the resilience of hope, the refusal to accept that everything is ended forever. One passage from the Lament for Ur describes the goddess Ningal's reaction to her city's destruction. She sees the enemy approaching. She sees her city surrounded. She knows what's coming and is powerless to stop it. "My city has been made into ruins," she says. "My house has been destroyed. The enemy has entered. I have been exiled from my city like a bird from its nest." This isn't abstract theology. This is a very human response to disaster, projected onto divine figures because that's how the Sumerians understood the world, through the actions and emotions of their gods. Another section describes the aftermath of battle. The people groan. It repeats like a refrain. The city seeks a place to rest but finds none. The house stretches out its hands but cannot grasp anything. Bodies lie in the streets. The living envy the dead because the dead don't have to witness the destruction. Children cry for their parents. Parents search for their children. No one can help anyone. The social bonds that make human life meaningful have all been severed. Everyone is alone in their suffering. The Lamentations also document specific details that help historians understand what actually happened. They name the enemy, the Elamites, and sometimes their allies. They describe the siege, how the city was surrounded, how supplies were cut off, how hunger weakened the population. They describe the assault, how the walls were breached, how the enemy poured in. They describe the looting, how treasures were carried off, how the temple was stripped of its valuables. They describe the captivity of the king, how Ibbi-Sin was taken to Elam and vanished from history. These details match what we know from other sources. Administrative tablets from the final years of Ibbi-Sin's reign show a state in crisis. Letters between the king and his officials document the breakdown of authority. One famous letter from Ishbi-Erra, the governor who would defect and found the dynasty of Isin, shows him manipulating the king, using control of grain supplies during a famine to build his own power base. The letter is obsequious on the surface, full of protestations of loyalty, but reading between the lines you can see Ishbi-Erra positioning himself to seize power. Year names from this period tell their own story. Instead of commemorating victories or building projects, they record disasters. The year when the Amorites entered the land, the year when Cimmeram and Lullabum were defeated, the year when Ur was surrounded by a siege wall, referring to Ur being besieged by its own rebellious provinces or by the enemy. The year when King Ibbi-Sin was taken captive by the Elamites. This last year name comes from the following dynasty, the Kingdom of Izin. because by then Ur-Thrud was finished. The state's last official act was its own destruction being recorded in a year name by its conquerors. Economic tablets provide the most concrete evidence of decline. Grain prices, as mentioned, increased 60-fold. But the tablets show more than just price inflation. They show the breakdown of the redistributive economy that had characterized Ur-3. Ration lists, which had been meticulously maintained, become irregular and incomplete. Workers weren't receiving their allotted food. The system that had fed tens of thousands of people was failing. Storage facilities show declining stocks. Tablets recording the movement of goods between cities become less frequent, evidence that trade and communication were disrupted. One tablet, a letter from a provincial governor, describes conditions in his region. The Amorites, he writes, are everywhere. They've cut the roads, merchants can't travel, grain can't be transported, the countryside isn't safe, farmers have fled to the cities, abandoning their fields, but the cities can't feed them, there's no food, the king must send help, the king must send soldiers, the king must send grain. But the response, if there was one, came too late or not at all. The Ur-3 state had lost the capacity to respond to crises in its provinces. Another tablet from the central administration at Ur records attempts to deal with the crisis. It lists emergency measures. Rations are reduced across the board. Non-essential workers are dismissed. Reserves are mobilized. But the tablet also shows confusion and desperation. The neat, ordered record-keeping that had characterized Ur-3 administration is breaking down. Entries are incomplete. Calculations are wrong. The bureaucrats who'd been trained to maintain the system didn't know what to do when the system itself was failing. Religious texts from the period show people turning to the gods for explanation and help. Omens were consulted, predictions sought. Temple rituals were performed with desperate intensity. Special offerings were made. Prayers were composed, pleading for divine intervention. But the gods, as the Lamentations would later explain, had already decided Ur's fate. This raises an interesting question about Mesopotamian theology. If the gods had decreed destruction, what was the point of prayer? Why perform rituals if the outcome was already determined? The answer lies in the Mesopotamian understanding of divine will and human agency. Yes, the gods decreed outcomes, but those decrees weren't arbitrary. They were based on human behavior, on whether kings and people properly honored the gods, maintained the temples, performed the rituals correctly. So prayer and ritual weren't futile. They were attempts to change the conditions that had led to the gods' unfavorable decision. If Ur repented, if the king humbled himself, if the people reformed their ways, perhaps the gods would relent. But they didn't relent. The destruction came anyway, and this required explanation, which the Lamentations provide. The gods had ordained that Ur's time was finished. Every city, every kingdom had an appointed duration, a span of years decreed by heaven. When that time expired, nothing could prevent the end. This was cosmic law, as unchangeable as the movements of the stars. Ur had enjoyed centuries of prosperity and power. Now its time was over. The kingship would move to other cities. This was the natural order of things. This explanation served a purpose beyond just theology. It preserved Sumerian pride and identity. It hadn't fallen because the Sumerians were weak or inferior. It hadn't fallen because their gods were powerless. It had fallen because divine cosmic law required it. Because nothing lasts forever. Because everything has its appointed time. This was a way of accepting defeat without accepting inferiority, of acknowledging loss without losing faith. The gods were still powerful. The Sumerians were still chosen, but even the gods couldn't prevent the natural cycles of creation and destruction that governed all existence. The Lamentations also contain hints of hope, promises of eventual restoration. The gods would return, the cities would be rebuilt, the temples would be restored, life would continue. This wasn't just wishful thinking. It reflected the Mesopotamian understanding of time as cyclical rather than linear. Kingdoms rose and fell, cities were destroyed and rebuilt. This had happened before and would happen again. Ur's destruction was catastrophic, yes, but it wasn't final. Eventually the wheel would turn, the gods would smile again on Sumer, and restoration would come. And in a limited sense, this hope was realized. Ur was partially resettled. The ziggurat was repaired. The cult of Nana was restored, though never to its former glory. The city limped on for centuries as a much smaller settlement, overshadowed by new powers. The dynasty of Isin, founded by the defector Ishbi-Erra, styled itself as the legitimate successor to Ur III and worked to restore Sumerian culture and administration. For a time, it seemed Sumer might revive. But the revival was illusory. Sumerian political power was finished. The language was dying. The population center was shifting north. New peoples, the Amorites, were becoming dominant. Within a few generations, Sumerian as a living language would be extinct, preserved only in schools and temples. The cities that had been the heartland of civilization would become backwaters, then ruins, then forgotten entirely until modern archaeologists rediscovered them. Yet the tablets recording all of this survived. They survived because they were written on clay, because clay baked by fire becomes virtually indestructible. They survived because some were buried in collapses and remained undisturbed for millennia. They survived because even after Sumerian civilization ended, later Mesopotamian peoples, Babylonians and Assyrians, continued to copy and study Sumerian texts. They valued Sumerian literature the way we value Greek and Roman classics. They preserved the Lamentations, copying them onto new tablets generation after generation, ensuring these poems of grief would outlast the grief itself. Today these tablets are scattered across the world in museum collections. The British Museum alone holds over 130,000 cuneiform tablets, many from Sumer. They sit in storage drawers and display cases, most of them still untranslated, still holding secrets about daily life, commerce, religion, and politics in the world's first civilization. Each tablet is a window into the past, a direct connection to people who lived 40, 45, 50 centuries ago. And occasionally, a newly translated tablet reveals something extraordinary, a previously unknown literary work, a historical event not recorded anywhere else, details of daily life that illuminate how people actually lived. The process of discovery continues. Every year brings new publications, new translations, new insights. Our understanding of Sumer grows richer and more nuanced. The dead civilization speaks more clearly as we learn to hear its voice. Today, Ur is a ruin in southern Iraq. The ziggurat still stands, partially reconstructed in modern times, but most of the ancient city is just low mounds of earth, hiding thousands of broken tablets and crumbled walls. Nippur, Uruk, Lagash, all are archaeological sites, not living cities. The Euphrates has shifted course since ancient times, leaving some sites in the desert far from any river. Others have been destroyed by looters, by agricultural activity, by modern development. The physical remains of Sumerian civilization are slowly vanishing. But the tablets survive. Not all of them, of course. Most of what was written is gone, crumbled to dust or still buried in unexplored ruins. But tens of thousands have been excavated and are preserved in museums and institutions around the world. The British Museum, the Louvre, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Oriental Institute, the National Museum of Iraq, all house substantial collections. New tablets are still being discovered, translated, published. Our understanding of Sumer continues to grow, and occasionally, in some quiet museum gallery or in the pages of an academic journal, you'll encounter a tablet that speaks across 4 millennia with shocking immediacy. A receipt for beer signed by a scribe whose name we still know. A student's homework, full of errors corrected by his teacher. A letter from a mother to her son. A hymn to a goddess. A king's boast. A merchant's account book. A poem lamenting a destroyed city. These aren't just artifacts. They're voices of people who lived, worked, loved, suffered, and died thousands of years ago. People not fundamentally different from us, who faced many of the same challenges we face, who built something remarkable and watched it fall apart. So what did the Sumerian tablets reveal about ancient warfare and the destruction of civilization? They revealed that it's not a simple story of barbarian invasions destroying sophisticated cultures, though that happened. They revealed that environmental factors, economic stress, administrative failure, and social tensions create vulnerabilities that external enemies can exploit. They revealed that civilizations can decline from within even as they appear strong from without. They revealed that the fall, when it comes, is experienced by individuals as personal catastrophe, not as some abstract historical process. They revealed that people knew something was wrong, that they tried to fix it, that their attempts were insufficient. They revealed grief and loss and the desperate need to understand why. They revealed that even in total defeat, people cling to hope, to belief that the gods will return, that the cities will be rebuilt, that life will continue, and in a sense they were right. Life did continue, just not as Sumerians, not in the same places, not in the same way, but the knowledge, the traditions, the cultural DNA passed on to successor peoples who built on the ruins. This is both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it means civilization is resilient. Ideas and knowledge can survive even when the societies that create them do not. Terrifying because it means no civilization is safe, no matter how powerful or sophisticated. The Sumerians invented writing, built the first cities, created the first empire, and they still fell. Rome fell. The Maya fell. Every civilization that has ever existed has either fallen or, if still around, will eventually fall. It's a matter of time and circumstances. The Sumerian tablets force us to confront this reality. They're a message from a dead civilization to future generations. This is what we were, they say. This is what we built. This is what we lost. Remember us. Learn from our mistakes. Don't make our errors. But also know that some things are beyond your control. Climate changes. Soil degrades. Enemies appear. Crisis comes. All you can do is face it with courage, document it honestly, and hope that something survives. And something did survive. The tablets themselves survived. The knowledge survived. The influence survived. Sumer died as a political entity 4,000 years ago, but we're still talking about it, still learning from it, still influenced by it. In that sense, the Sumerians achieved a kind of immortality. Not the immortality of their kings and cities, which fell to dust, but the immortality of ideas, of knowledge, of culture. These things, fragile as they seem, can outlast empires. If you found this exploration valuable, if it made you think about our own civilization's trajectory and vulnerabilities, do me a favor and hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into history's forgotten corners, into the stories that textbooks skip, into the human reality behind the archaeological sites and museum displays. Drop a comment with your thoughts. What lessons do you take from the Sumerian collapse? Are we making the same mistakes they did? Can we do better, or are we caught in the same cycles? These are questions worth pondering in the quiet hours when the modern world's noise fades and we can hear the voices from the past. The parallels to our own time are both obvious and subtle. We face environmental degradation through climate change and resource depletion. We have complex bureaucratic states that may be too rigid to adapt to rapid change. We're interconnected through global trade and communication in ways that create systemic vulnerabilities. We're depleting soils and water resources in the pursuit of maximum agricultural productivity. We face migrations driven by environmental and economic pressures. We have rivals and enemies who would exploit our weaknesses. The specifics are different, but the patterns echo across 4 millennia. Does this mean collapse is inevitable? Not necessarily. Unlike the Sumerians, we understand environmental science. We can predict climate changes and soil degradation. We have technology the ancients couldn't imagine. We can communicate instantly across the globe. We have the accumulated wisdom of thousands of years of history, including the Sumerian example, to learn from. We know what happened to civilizations that ignored environmental limits, that allowed inequality to spiral out of control, that failed to adapt to changing conditions. Knowledge is power if we choose to use it. But knowledge alone isn't enough. The Sumerians weren't stupid. They knew their soil was becoming salinized. They could see crop yields declining. They knew the irrigation systems needed constant maintenance. They knew environmental stress was making their civilization vulnerable. But knowing and acting are different things. The Earth estate needed maximum agricultural production to support its armies and bureaucracy. Taking land out of production to let it recover, or massively investing in new irrigation systems, or relocating population to less degraded areas, all these solutions had short-term costs that the state couldn't or wouldn't pay. So they kept farming the same land intensively, extracting every bit of productivity they could, until the soil could give no more. Sound familiar? We know fossil fuels cause climate change. We know we're depleting aquifers and degrading soils. We know biodiversity loss threatens ecosystem stability. We know inequality and social tensions are rising. But the short-term costs of addressing these problems seem too high, too disruptive to current systems, too threatening to existing power structures. So we keep doing what we're doing, hoping technology or luck will save us, hoping the crisis will wait until after the next election, or the next quarter's earnings, or our own lifetimes. The Sumerians hoped too. They prayed to their gods. They performed rituals. They made offerings. They hoped divine favor would solve their problems. It didn't. The difference is that we don't have the excuse of ignorance or the comfort of believing gods control everything. We know our actions shape our future. We know the consequences of our choices. If our civilization collapses, we won't be able to blame it on divine decree or cosmic cycles or barbarian invasions. We'll have to acknowledge that we knew better and failed to act anyway. That's a terrifying responsibility, but also an empowering one. We're not helpless. We're not doomed. We have choices the Sumerians didn't have if we're willing to make them. Until next time, take care of yourselves and remember, every civilization thinks it's permanent until the moment it isn't. The Sumerians thought their cities were eternal. The Akkadians thought their empire would last forever. The kings of Ur believed their dynasty was divinely ordained. They were all wrong. We might be too. The difference is we have their warnings carved in clay, preserved against all odds, waiting for us to read and understand. The tablets speak to us across 4,000 years, offering lessons purchased at the cost of an entire civilization's destruction. Let's hope we're wise enough to listen. Let's hope we're brave enough to act. Because the alternative, as the tablets make painfully clear, is to join Sumer in the long list of civilizations that rose, flourished briefly, and fell into darkness, leaving only ruins and regrets for future generations to sift through and study.